The year is 1189. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, has just returned from the Third Crusade, where he failed to capture Jerusalem from the Ayyubid dynasty led by Saladin. And now the English are preparing for war against France because that's always a good idea. But before they can get into any scuffles with the Frenchies, they have to deal with the Welsh, who have risen in rebellion under the leadership of Madog Ap Gruffudd. So Richard decides to go on a little detour through Wales to put down this rebellion and teach these unruly subjects a lesson they won't forget. And boy, do they learn their lesson. Richard's force consists of 4,000 English infantry and 2,000 cavalry, while the Welsh have around 10,000 men. But don't worry about the English because they brought along 30 elephants, which were captured from the Saracens during the Crusade and given to the English by Louis VII of France. That's right, France gave war elephants to England. Why? Well, the French must have thought they could control the English better if they had more elephants. And they also probably didn't know that elephants need water every day, or maybe they just really hate the English. It's hard to say. So Richard marches his army through Wales and terrorizes the countryside, killing rebels and burning their villages. He even executes prisoners in front of their families, but still no Welsh king shows up to challenge him. And this makes Richard sad because he wants a good fight. Luckily for him, he gets one. While besieging the town of Flint, Richard's knights rode out to face a much larger Welsh force. And it was here that the English and Welsh fought one of the most spectacular battles in history. Richard divided his men into two wings, one on the right led by himself, and one on the left led by his brother, King John. The infantry formed the bulk of both wings and were armed with longbows, arrows, swords, and shields. But the cavalry was deployed in the center of the English lines. They were armed with lances, swords, and bucklers, and wore chainmail, which was lucky because this battle would be remembered as the last charge of the Lion Knights. As the Welsh advanced, the English launched a massive arrow storm into their ranks, which caused them to falter and lose momentum. This allowed the English cavalry to form a kind of protective circle around the infantry and launch counterattack after counterattack. But the Welsh kept coming. They came like a flood, an unstoppable torrent of humanity armed with swords and axes and spears. And though the English held them off at first, the numbers were too great. The Welsh broke through the center of the English lines and split the protecting circle of cavalry in two. And now the English infantry were in big trouble. They needed help, and they needed it fast. But luckily for them, the rest of Richard's cavalry were just getting into the thick of things. So far, they had been holding back, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now was their moment. As the Welsh surged forward and pressed the English infantry back toward their own lines, the remaining English cavalrymen charged into the fray. It was like watching a knightly ballet. Each knight carried a shield emblazoned with the royal coat of arms of England, a gold lion rampant on a red background. Their armor was polished until it gleamed like a mirror, and their lances were tipped with sharp, deadly iron. Together they formed a second protective ring around the beleaguered English infantry. Again they attacked, and again the Welsh broke through. This time, however, the English were ready for them. Every man fought like a cornered lion, lashing out with sword and shield and spear. Men fell on both sides, but slowly the English began to gain the upper hand. Finally, the Welsh attacks became less frequent and less violent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. The Welsh were routed and fled into the hills. But what was the cost of this victory? The English had lost 600 men and 10 elephants. But the living were soon to become fewer, because Richard ordered the surviving Welshmen to be hunted down and executed. He left no room for mercy. If anyone survived the battle, they died by the sword of an English knight. As for the English nobles who led the cavalry charge, well, they all died. That's why this was the last charge of the Lion Knights. Every single one of them was killed in the battle. Some were taken out by stray Welsh arrows, others by unlucky blows of swords or spears. But most died when the English broke through the Welsh lines. You see, when you're in a big group and charging at full speed, It's pretty easy to die. Just ask Henry II, who died in a similar fashion at the Battle of Bouvines. One of the main reasons so many knights died was that they knocked each other off their horses. Another reason was that they crashed into trees. Seriously, how many knights does it take to knock a tree down? Apparently, it takes quite a few, because the forest near the River Alne was filled with dead knights and broken lances. And finally, there was no medical care. Back then, if you were knocked off your horse and your armor was dented, you were basically dead. The armor was designed to protect you from blows of sword and arrow, but not from blunt trauma like crashing into a tree. So if a knight was thrown from his mount, he wouldn't die instantly, but he would bleed internally and slowly slip away. There was nothing anyone could do to help him. Surgery was unheard of, and even if it had been available, the poor guy would have bled out long before the surgeon could arrive on the scene. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the English nobles who died during the charge. First, we have Geoffrey de Mandeville, the 2nd Earl of Essex. Geoffrey was a badass. He wasn't even supposed to be at the battle, but he showed up anyway and immediately charged into the thick of the fight. He was eventually killed by a Welsh nobleman named Cargan, who decapitated him in single combat. Next, we have William de Ferrers, 5th Earl of Derby. William was another badass. He led his men with such ferocity that he was known as the Lion of the North. He was eventually killed when his horse was gored in the chest by a Welsh spear. Then there was Robert de Quincy, 2nd Earl of Huntingdon. Robert was a good friend of Richard the Lionheart. He was killed when he crashed into a tree during the charge. Finally, we have Hugh de Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland. Hugh was a brave warrior, but he was also a coward. At the end of the battle, when most of the English knights had already died, he took his horse and fled. Richard was furious and had him put to death for abandoning his post. Now, those are just the nobles who died during the charge itself. There were a lot more who died before and after. For example, there was William Marshal, 1st Earl of Pembroke. William was one of the greatest knights of the era. He was killed during the Siege of Flint. Then there was John Marshal, brother of William and Knight of the Order of St. John. He was killed fighting the Welsh. And finally we have William de Solby, Bishop of London. William was a badass, period. He was killed while trying to save the life of a captured Welshman. All in all, it's estimated that between 15 and 20% of the English nobility was wiped out during the battle. That's why the English were hesitant to charge into battle after this. They had seen firsthand the price of such an attack, and they didn't want to pay it again. But what about Richard the Lionheart? Was he afraid to charge into battle after this? No, he wasn't. In fact, he went on to conquer more of Wales and then went to the Holy Land for a second time. Maybe he wasn't affected by the loss of the nobles because he wasn't particularly close to any of them. After all, most of them were related to him either by blood or marriage. Richard was an orphan who came to power as a young man and spent most of his reign dealing with rebellions and wars. He didn't have time to make friends. Plus, he was a bit of a dick, so most people didn't like him very much. After putting down the Welsh rebellion, Richard set his sights on France, where the long-awaited war was just beginning. But that, my friends, is a story for another day. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. And if you want to watch another video, I recommend this one.